And hello everyone, welcome back to another NIM tutorial. In this tutorial, we'll be taking a look at OOP, also known as Object Orientated Programming. Now, Object Orientated Programming has a core fundamental idea that everything you're working with is some sort of object. Now, OOP has things like, let's say you have an animal, and that animal is an object. You have a boat, that boat is an object. Where in functional programming, you'd have things like a boat, but it will be a data type or some sort of data that's raw. It wouldn't be modified to be some sort of object. On the end of the day, you do not need to use OOP in your day-to-day coding, but the same can be said for functional programming. You can choose either or use both. I use both. I use them as I see they will fit to work. So let's do an example of that. Let's create a new file. Let's delete everything else in here except for main.nim. Since we now know how modules work, we don't need these. And let's create a new file called animal.nim. Now, animal.nim will contain our animal object, and our animal object will contain data of an animal. So we can say type, and we specify animal, and we use an asterisk to specify this object is going to be public, so we can use this object outside of this file. We can then make that equal to an object, and by indenting, we will be adding attributes to this object. So we can add a name, so every animal can have a name. We provide an asterisk here as well, because if you don't provide an asterisk, this will be a private property of this object. A private property of this object cannot be accessed in a different file. So if you add an asterisk, then if another file imports this object or this file, we'd be able to access it. So this name. But if it was like this and we said string, we would not be able to access name here. We'll take a deeper look at this a little bit later. And we can add two more. One can be alive, so the animal is alive. And one can be fullness. So how full is the animal after eating? Alive can be a boolean and fullness can be an int. So let's say 20%. Cool. Now we already have this object, however, we can't do a lot with it. Currently, it's just structured data. We just have an animal object and it has a name, and a live state, and how full it is. So it's not very useful, but we can add functions to it. So let's start by creating a procedure called unlive. Now the reason I'm calling it unlive is so I can still say they monetized on YouTube. Thank you, YouTube. And we can say animal. Now we go var animal. Now by doing this, we're saying this animal here is linked to this animal object. So this function here is linked to this object. It's now a function of that object. And here we just specify animal.alive. So this is how we can access the alive property of this animal. And we'll get to actually using these stuff later and whatnot. But for right now, this is how you can access this property inside of animal. And we can set that to false, so they're no longer alive. And we can just maybe echo animal.name. So now we can access the name as well. And was overfed. So in this case, we're assuming they're overfed. We're not going to go super complex. Note, unalive is a private function. It cannot be used outside of this file. That's why we don't have an asterisk here. Next up, let's create a procedure called feed. And feed will be public. And just like with unalive, we will take animal, pass it in like this. So it is this property here. And the reason we use var here and not just this is because when we do this here, we need to modify the original animal. If we do not specify var here, we will not modify the original object. we will create a new object and give it that new attribute. By specifying var here, we're saying pass it in by reference. Then here we can say if animal.fullness is less than 100, then animal.fullness plus equal 1. Else, if their fullness is not less than 100, then animal.unalive or unlive. So here you'll notice we access this unlive here by just using a dot. So we just use dot and unlive. As simple as that. Now, by running unlive here, our animal will now no longer be alive. And note, we can still use this unalive or unlive because it is part of this animal object, and just because it's private doesn't mean we can't use it. It's just a private function to this animal object now. And then we can also go procedure is full, which is public, which will get the animal. However, in this case, since we are not modifying any values within this animal here, we can just go animal. If you are modifying a value, such as fullness or name or alive, if you are changing them, then you want to pass in by a reference. But if you're not changing anything, there's no reason to pass in by reference. You can just pass in normally. And of course we can say boolean, because it returns true or false. And then here we can just say return animal fullness more than 80. So if it's full, it will return true. So in this case, we cannot modify the original. If we were to go animal.alive is equal to false, it will not affect, as you can see here, cannot be assigned to. It will not affect this animal alive because we are not passing in by reference. We're just passing in a normal variable. It copies it and then changes it here. We're not even returning this animal again. So there's no reason for us to change it here. So that is the difference there. Now let's actually use this object we created in main.nim. To use the object, all we need to do is go import animal. Now we import our module, and as simple as that, we can use this animal. So here we can say for Timmy, like all other human beings, is an animal. And they have a name, Timmy. They are alive. And their fullness is, let's say, 98. There we go. Now, Timmy here, we can access about any value from Timmy. And it does not need to be var, it can be lit. Doesn't really matter. Anyhow, by going echo Timmy dot, and then here is everything we can use. Notice unlive is not here due to the fact that unlive is private, but everything else we can access. So we can check is Timmy full, and here we can go dot, we can check the fullness itself, we can check the name, and we can check the alive status. Run this, and there we go. They are full, it's 98, Timmy is the name, and they are alive. Now we can simply go Timmy.feed, and again Timmy.feed, and then Timmy will no longer be of this realm. And the reason we're getting that is this should actually be var, since the values inside of it can change. So that actually does matter. My bad. Now when we feed Timmy 2 times, he will now be full and he will be unalived. So if we run this, we get 100, Timmy, and true. Now I think, yes, as long as it is less than 100, okay, so we just need to feed Timmy one more time and we'll get the message saying Timmy is no longer, or he is now overfed. And then he has been unalived. And that is how you modify these values in here. Hopefully this gave you an idea of the basics of objects and how they work. However, there's still a lot more to cover. So let's actually go to covering a couple more. So this is the basics of creating one of these. Of course, you You don't need to create a module for it. That's just generally good practice to create a module for each and every class. But you could have done this and it would have worked out perfectly fine as well. In our case, creating a module just keeps everything cleaner. Alright, so let's create a couple more objects. In this case, let's create a type and we'll call it person. Person is a ref object of root object. Now let me explain this. So ref is just used to extend, or in other words, inherit from an object. In this case, we're inheriting from the root object, which is just a basic object that is provided by nim. It is like the most root or the most bare bones version of an object you can get. Without root object though, other projects would not be allowed to inherit, or other objects would not be allowed to inherit from this object. So you need to extend root object so other objects has the ability to extend this object, if that makes sense. However, you mainly don't have to worry about this. This is only if you want your object to be extendable. And we'll get to what I mean by extendable later on. So here we go, name. And let's just make that public. It's a string. Here we have age, and that's an int. Age, however, is going to be private, just as an example. Then let's create another type. This type will be called student. Now I can think of a student as another person. If you look at the student next to you in class, that's a person. Even though you may not like them, they're still a person. So in our case, our student is still going to be a person. They're still going to have a name, they're still going to have an age, but this time, because they're a student, they might have a grade and an IQ attached. So we can say ref object of, and now we'll inherit the person, and we'll add grade, which is an int, and IQ, which is an int. Now, let's just use this a little bit just so we know what we're talking about. So let's create a person, and we can even go as far as doing something like this. Person, and we can later on implement the actual person. By going person is equal to person, name, Nick, and age 50. As simple as that. Now it's as easy as going echo person.name and person.age. If we run this, we get Nick and 50. However, take note, unlike with other languages, just because this here is a private property does not mean we can't use it outside of the function. That is one thing you do need to take note of. This only means you can't use it outside of a file. So that is why it's usually a good idea to create a whole new file when you want to create an object, because this will allow you to have easier access control to properties inside of your object. But as simple as that, we have Nick and 50. Now if we want to create a student, we can do student, which is of type student, and they are a student, and here we can add all of the properties. Grade, let's say they are a grade 10. So let's just make it an average of 50. But the difference is here, we have more than just grade and IQ. Because we extended the person object, we also have the name and age. So here we go, name, and we can make their name Jack, and age, which we can make, I believe 16 is the age, that's in grade 10. So now we have a student, which has all of the properties of person, as well as all of the properties of student, because student inherits of person, meaning student gets everything person has. This is nice because that means each object you build can build off of the previous object you made. For example, a car object doesn't need to have a ton of things. You just have a wheel object, and then the car object inherits the wheel object. Now the car can have the wheels and all of its properties. And it can inherit the windows and everything else and all of those things' properties. That means you don't need one massive object. You can just have one big object that has a ton of minor objects inside of it. Inheritance is something you have to play with to grasp. So if you're new to programming, you might be thinking to yourself, you don't quite understand what's up with this. The whole object-oriented approach to a lot of beginners might be difficult. So if you're a beginner and you're having trouble understanding, it's not as difficult as you try to perceive it. It's just an object. You can think of it as a car is an object. A car has windows, a car has tires, just like a person has a name and a person has an age. And here all we're doing is we're giving that person their name and age. And now we're saving it in this variable. Whenever we want to access it, we do this. Now, next up, let's go and let's give these methods. Or let's give student method at least. And also we can put student here and it should work the same. It's basically drop-in replacement, IQ, and grade. If we run that, we get Jack, 16, 50, and 10. Anyhow, so let's create a couple of methods for our student to use. Now we could go procedure and say study, and this will make the student study. However, I want us to use, instead of procedure or function, I want us to use method. Now, method is the same as a procedure, but it has been specifically made to be used with classes. The reason for this is so it's easier to understand your code. You might have procedures, which is basically the all-around thing you use, but methods, since it's directed to classes, it makes a couple of things easier for you. For example, we can do something such as this, or self, or whatever you want to call this. You can even call this person, or X, or Y, or whatnot. In this case, I'll call it this, because a lot of you might be coming from C++ or Java, and this might make it a bit easier. And we say student. Take note here, we do not have to say this var student, because this is a method. So it will automatically go, oh, okay, I am part of this. I'm part of this student here, so it will automatically get that mentality. So you do not need to go var student. In fact, let's leave it there for a second. Say string, and then also at the end, add this base. So this is currently out of the scope of this tutorial, but just note that basically all methods requires this base tag here. But we'll cover these more in the future. For right now, just use base. And we can make that equal to just this dot I. Yeah, let's of course indent this dot IQ plus equal 5. So now it'll be 5 IQ smarter. And you'll notice you won't get any errors if you do this. In fact, let's go student.iq here. Now, oops, my bad. Let's just remove that. We didn't need that string there. That's for a different function. Here, now all we need to do is just copy that. We then go student, of course, dot study. And if we run this, my bad. If we run this, we'll get 50 and then it's 55. If we remove this var, you'll notice we don't get any errors and it works the same. That's the benefit of using a method over a procedure when it comes to classes or objects, because this method here just makes it 20 times easier since it knows it's going to be used with a class or an object. We can also give a method to person. And here we can go birthday. And we can just go age plus equal 1. Now, we can actually copy this. And the first one can be a person. And we can just get their age. Same here of student, get their age. And we just go dot birthday. And I deleted my person. Let me just go person again. There we go. You'll notice we can use student here as well. We'll also have birthday. So student and person both have the birthday function. And here you'll notice we get 50, 51, and then 16, and then 17. And we can of course pass in more values in here. For example, we can say years. And in years here, we can specify it in here. Like have a birthday with 5 years in the future. And of course, it won't do anything unless we go years. And let's just make that 1 by default. Now if we run that, we go 50, then 55. And here it's 16 to 17. This is just to show you the versatility of how these methods and functions and procedures and whatnot work. The first value here, that's just what you're going to be using this with, the object. And then the rest is just values you can pass in. And then finally, let's add one more, just so we can get the hang of this. Method getIQ. This student, so this will be a function of the student. Note, however, now that we're on this topic, we cannot use study with person because person doesn't have grade or IQ. It doesn't have study, and it's not going to have getIQ. Only student has that. Student has all the things of person because student is inheriting everything from person, just like you would inherit things from your parents. You might inherit your parents' wealth. You might inherit your parents' hairstyles or eye colors. Student inherits from person. So you can think of this as the child and then the parent. And then this is the grandpa. And you can use this child-parent method to think of how everything will work. Like I inherited my name from my dad. So I have my dad's name. So that is something I inherited. It's also a property I inherited as a person. Every person has a name. Anyhow, so that's just something you take note of. And in here, let's go getIQ. It will return a string. And we can just specify base. And in return, this.name has an IQ of this.IQ. And we can use $symbol here since we need to convert this integer into a string. So that's just a normal function for nim. Doesn't have anything to do with the classes, just $to convert. And now here we can of course go get IQ. And now it will get us the IQ of this student. And of course this needs something, so we can go echo. We can't just not do anything with it. And boom. As simple as that, Jack has an IQ of 50. So that's the basics of OOP. If you're having trouble wrapping your head around this, it's perfectly fine. Some people do take a while to grasp the concept of OOP, what it does, how it works. But in simple terms, it's just an object. It's just like a car or a person, as you can see here, with properties like name and age, and functions attached to it. You cannot use this getIQ without a student, as simple as that. And it just makes your code somewhat more structured. You don't have to use it. Some people are completely against it. Others are completely for it. I myself do not care for it that much. If I see a use for it, I'll use it. If I don't see a use for it, I won't use it. Usually, when I do game development specifically, you'll notice I would use this because I find it to be easier to manage when you do game development. Okay, and then finally, I would just like us to do a couple more things. So here we have student. If we do student like this, you'll notice we get an error because it doesn't know how to display student. But if we add brackets to the end, it will be able to display student for us. There we go. Grade, IQ, name, and age. Simple as that. Next up, we can also go if student of student. And this will check if the variable is of this type of object. So you want to see if student is a student type. We can then just echo it is. If we run this, we'll get it is. If we were to say person, we'd get it is because student inherits from person. So student is still a person. It's just a person extended. But if we were to put person here and say student, then we won't get anything because a person is not a student. Just because you're a person doesn't mean you're in school. You might be at work now, so you're not a student. But a person is still a person. Even though, notice here, nim is telling us like, hey, there's no reason to compare them because a person is a person. But yeah, there you go, it is. So that's an easy way to tell if something is of a type object, or if it's inheriting from it at least. And yeah, thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed and learned a little bit about OOP in nim. And I will see you all again in the next nim tutorial.